in the first part, we spent a lot of time delving into the approach and the intention, and then today, or in this video rather, we're going to explore more of the concepts, right? Which was the original point. So that's what we're going to do. A few things that I like to rehash or at least repeat are some of the concepts, since that they are so important to the entire premise of what we're doing. I just want to take this intro section of this the second part to do exactly that, and then we're going to repeat the process as before. So one of these things, two of these things really, two main things, are the free energy principle, like what we were saying before, which effectively is that in Fristen's conceptualization, if we repeat this, in a condensed fashion, is how all living systems try to maintain homeostasis or stability, even remaining alive, by minimizing the difference between what they expect to sense or experience and what they actually sense, right? So that is the model. What is it, like contrasting the model between the agent and the arena, or the agent and the environment, which also means that I used the term variational free energy last time, which is more like the cost function, which is just kind of measuring like how badly is my expectation misaligned, right? Which is what they essentially call like prediction error, which of course ties into the entire model. Like how complex or how precise is my model of the world, right? But also as me of an agent, and how big is the prediction error? And that's the variational free energy, right? So that kind of explains this part. I hope, anyway. The other one is the attractor landscape, and now I can put it up on screen what an attractor landscape is, because I tried to give the illustration, verbally, but now you can just see that it's a valley and a state. And I got this from a paper that I currently forgot the title of. Like maybe I still have it open. Yeah. So it's called A Dynamical Systems View of Psychiatric Disorders. So it's pretty interesting, which the essence is that it talks about a healthy state and a fragile state. And a fragile state, a disordered fragile state being, you can kind of see it in the illustration, how you have a fragile health state and a very robust disordered state or diseased state, and that you see that in people with, like, I don't just want to say autoimmune diseases, like just different levels of these disorders or diseases, that their disease or disorder state is so dominant that it becomes an attractor landscape, as you can see, like a gravitational well. Everything pulls towards that quote unquote deepest point, right? So that's kind of what we're looking at here, and it's the reverse is also applicable for people that are very healthy in the robust sense, that have exceptionally not just good necessarily biology, but that are also putting in the work. Obviously, they tend to come together, and they bounce out of disease states or disorder states very quickly, and return to their baseline attractor state, which is like attractor states are a concept that go even into like how the self is modeled. So it's pretty extensive as a concept as well, which is why it's featured into this the paper that we're working with or reading from. So as this kind of explains the concepts, I want to get into more of the actual quotes from the markings that I made in the paper, and work from there, because there was a few things that I, as I said, skipped over that I want to address now, that I think would be beneficial for our exploration, and then we can add these elements, because this is how the approach goes. I add these elements and then I try to explain them, and then later down the line, like, let's try to see if I can make a coherent picture out of the entire thing. So diving back into the paper, there's actually one more thing that I wanted to add, like the math for the free energy principle. Like, yeah, since I said that in the previous video, recall Friston is a neuroscientist and has done these like mathematic I don't know, explorations on this, or deep dives. So I've put them up on the screen here, which just to me personally, like, I really suck at math, and like that, like when I have one of the AIs tell me like what the formula means, then it's obviously easier. But if you gave me this formula just out of the blue, I would just look at it and go like, yeah, I don't know what to do with this. So I'm good at patterns in general, or pattern recognition, and formulaic synthesis of certain things. But in this type of more of what is to me an abstract way, it's not an intuitive way, and this already ties into the paper, then it's just like kind of not a skill that I've developed very well, that I lean into my intuitive nature on how these patterns work. Anyway, that's just an aside. So to continue where we left off, with insight, the signal becomes clearer and contains a more external information about the path, right? As we talked about pathfinding, but there is still uncertainty about the details. With analysis, uncertainty is reduced further as every step in the path is now understood. So that's effectively what they were talking about, the functionality of the pathfinding mechanism, and how that there's a destination involved with this. And the insight and analysis are two parts of this approach, right, that you naturally, typically anyway, do. Moving on, more speculatively, intuition is to agency what insight and analysis are to consciousness, with agency being the term that evolutionary neurobiologists use to describe the flexible decision-making abilities found in almost all living organisms, from cells to human infants. That should make some sense, right? Moving on, this is based on the work of a certain Colleen Seifert. I'm not sure how to pronounce this name, but moving forward, who proposed a distinct mechanism for storing important yet unsolved problems. These problems serve as guides for future intuitions and insights. Here we explore Seifert's hypothesis from a systems neuroscience perspective, arguing that rather than being stored in anatomical structures, these unsolved problems form an attractor landscape, ding ding ding, that is subject to the laws of nonlinear dynamical systems, including the free energy principle and metastability. So that's something that, that's why I brought in the attractor landscape position, because effectively the case, or a part of the case that they're making, is that it's not just about neuroanatomical I'm not sure if the word is capacities, but your structures have a certain form, a density, wiring, activity levels, resource flow, and that, I think, right, like from everything that I've read from this paper, although we're doing a lot based on memory here, that it's not just about the neuroanatomical parts, as we looked into some of the neuroanatomy in the previous part, but that it's also about these different systems, right, or mechanisms rather, that come into play when we are looking at how the brain functions in this way, as an integrative way, rather, right, with all of these different aspects working together. So, since we didn't address the next part, which is effectively how they tie in more of the neuroscience, now that we've kind of already jumped over we did the neuroanatomy part, so we're going to continue with the rest of the neuroscience. In the paper, they state Intuition is seen as coherence or the ability to create non-conscious links between information. Insight, meanwhile, is the process by which sudden comprehension and resolution of a situation arises into consciousness. Right. So again, these two things come together quite distinctly, which is why I put it in this format or in this slide particular, because that's how they hang together in terms of pattern recognition, because that's something that they're going to be talking about extensively, or at least to a good degree in the next segment. So more on the pattern recognition, they're moving from the principle of the metastable brain, which goes as first, the metastable brain might balance various cognitive processes dynamically, allowing intuitive judgments to emerge without overt analysis. Moreover, as we explore below, intuition relates to past experiences and pattern recognition. In the metastable brain, large-scale brain networks are quickly accessed and interconnecting, allowing for the subjective felt sense of a solution before the slower processes take over. Second, for intuition to occur, the brain might rapidly and flexibly integrate disparate pieces of information from various sources, crucially in a nonlinear fashion. Third, intuitive judgments may be transient, in other words, arising and fading suddenly. This is aligned with the metastability as a description of transient tendencies, that is, those that exist between fully stable states, which is already like another very interesting aspect or element of what this paper talks about, and why I wanted to highlight the integrative nature of this and how pattern recognition is obviously a significant part of the entire thing. So this is why we're kind of, again, doing this, because it kind of shows us how different levels of integration occur neurologically for intuition to arise, which is a part of why we're looking at this. The other aspect, or another quote rather, that I wanted to add is that they're saying that in general, insight is correlated with greater activity in the right hemisphere than in the left, as the former has been linked to coarser semantic coding and is more likely to find broader and less obvious solutions. Which, maybe you don't know, actually, a lot of the social emotional structures are also in the right hemisphere. There's a lot on the hemispheric, what do you call this, theories and how hemispheres interact and integrate information, which is a complete aside technically. But seeing that this is mentioned here, you have that the left brain is far more like detail oriented or zoomed in, where the right brain does more zooming out, right? Which is, kind of what they're saying here, coarser semantic coding, right? Coarser, broader, or rougher, which is, when we talk about this like subconscious level of intuition from this angle, as in putting together all this information, I think that makes sense to a lot of people. Like, I keep using the word intuitively in this, but intuitively, that when you are absorbed and immersing and integrating a lot of information in the subconscious, you have these emergences, right, as they say it, with intuition and insight, from this processing that happens in the background. And here, just an aspect that they laid out is that this is done, or not just exclusively, but just with greater activity in the right hemisphere. And you can kind of see why, right? As if that part of the brain deals with broader or coarser information processing, then that kind of gives you an idea that, like, okay, when you put that together into this formula, let's call it, then you see that you need a broader coursing or parsing of information for intuition to emerge, and that it's not. I mean, again, like it can be in more like detailed things like this. It's not like that doesn't happen. It's not like intuition doesn't have a detailed oriented expression thereof, just like insight does. I think that just given the amount of information that you're processing, it just makes sense that the right hemisphere has greater activity in this way. As they talk about it for insight here, right? In general, rather, but I think you can make a case for this being also involved. I mean, must be right with intuition as well, although they don't state that specifically here. Continuing with the case that they make about insight and then how it relates to metastability and the pattern recognition, and then the attractor states, right? Since we've brought them up before, then we're gonna go a little bit deeper into this, and I'm gonna read this part of a lot more of this part because I just think it's such a good explanation for all of this, which I think is great. So that's where we're gonna dive into it. So they start off saying that insight is characterized by feelings of unexpectedness, elation, satisfaction, and conscious awareness, the big phenomenological characteristics of an aha moment, right? Intuition, meanwhile, is an embodied sensation marked by uncertainty about its origin and meaning. I think that's this is a great definition. That's why we're using it. So the above scenario is an example of a Wallace classic 4-stage cycle of creativity, preparation, incubation, illumination, and verification. Poser called this the prepared mind perspective. Seifert attempted to formalize this model, proposing that the mind cycles through a series of information processing stages that begin with preparation or the explicit consideration of a problem. This is followed by incubation, which entails setting the problem aside and thinking about something else for a while. I think, like if you've done problem solving, then that sounds very, like natural, I would believe. Next are the third and fourth stages, illumination and verification. That is the arrival of the insight itself, followed by its validation. More importantly, the authors propose that during the preparation stage, when the mind fails to find a solution to the problem, these failures get stored in long-term memory where they can help steer the individual toward a later insight, a phenomenon they term opportunistic assimilation. In opportunistic assimilation, the memory of an unsolved problem guides future information processing by non-consciously preparing the brain to recognize potential solutions. That's very cool, right? You have this storage in your long-term memory for unsolved problems, that there's still a subconscious tracking of solutions, and that whenever a part of this problem or a solution thereof is represented in some way, or whatever puzzle piece falls into place, you just kind of get that right, which is amazing. So then they talk about these patterns, right, and how this opportunistic assimilation functions over long timescales. And they write, these coherent, or to use the more common term, stable patterns are referred to as attractors. When an individual has an intuition and or an insight, this is an example of a stable attractor or a solution to a problem that is a temporary point of stasis in an otherwise dynamic environment, which is exactly why that illustration works so well, right? The more that this attractor landscape is formed, the more you see that information that is relevant would be guided towards the attractor state. So they just have I think what do you call it, like a more defined explanation for when a system is metastable, which adds to this entire concept of the attractor state and the bouncing in and out, as I've said before. So let's just see what they say about that. A system is metastable when its dynamics tend toward a stable attractor or coordination pattern, but are never entirely trapped by that attractor, which is essentially what I've said partially. Metastability allows the system to remain poised on the edge of criticality, where it has remarkable information processing capabilities and maximum cognitive and behavioral flexibility without descending into disorder. Which is, that's where the, let's call it, a dividing line lies between that paper of dynamical systems in terms of psychiatric disorders and how attractor landscapes will work and do work in terms of healthy brains, right? Or normal brains. What is normal, but maybe just a healthy or stable in this sense, as they say, that it doesn't stick. Which also you can kind of see, like, if you extrapolate these attractor states to people that are very obsessive, you see that most, like, they have a very well-defined and very entrenched attractor state around the subject or expression of their obsession, right? I think that's a good way to look at it. And somebody that's more adaptable or flexible in certain senses, at least in a very stable brain, will be able to jump in and out, maybe that's not the best way to put it, but bounce back between these, the attractor state for the amount of, like, as they say, maximum cognitive and behavioral flexibility, right? Without that resulting in a disorder. I think that's a very, very good point with all of this. So then they go on to say that the storage of the unsolved problem in long-term memory changes an attractor landscape, allowing the brain to move closer to the edge of criticality and ultimately a single attractor that is the solution. Thus, rather than being stored in distinct anatomical structures, we propose that these indices of failures to solve problems form a multi-stable attractor landscape that may reflect a heightened uncertainty which the system tends to resolve through unconscious processes. Which is, again, like, that's anyone that has gone through this process, that should reflect a very natural, experience of this, right? Like, you know that some of these things get into the background, but I think that clarifies as to what actually is happening, again, to a certain extent, in the subconscious as it deals with these, the problem solving for both your insight and your intuition. I think very often when people talk about subconscious or the subconscious, I mean, they seemingly, right? I can't speak, too broadly or generally, but they're typically speaking about what is like the psychological undercurrent of the psyche, right? Like whatever is not in the conscious awareness. So they say like your subconscious, and I think like there's a technical differentiation between subconscious and unconscious depending on who you ask. So that already begs a definition or a clarification thereof. Whenever that comes up, I think it's important to relate, or at least to explore, that the entire subconscious, unconscious concept is also built on all of the biology and neurology that goes on in the background, right? Like, obviously, one of these things, as we were talking about, emotion and interoception, are a lot of it is under the conscious awareness, right? So it's subconscious below conscious awareness, and is a part of the entire unconscious and everything that it processes, as we were kind of just talking about, in how long-term storage happens. And memory storage is also a very expanded or expansive premise, right? Like there's even memory storage in organs. I mean, your heart is maybe a more obvious one. They recently found a research paper, or they found as they related in a research paper rather, that even the kidneys store memory. So there is so much around memory. Water can store memory. It's a really crazy topic that I'm not going to go into right here right now. But to again give you kind of like a sense of how many rabbit holes or expansive, you know, angles and dimensions this entire premise has. So one of the quotes later in the paper that I'm going to read now also goes into a part of this in terms of what I was saying around like how much of your subconscious, unconscious as a biological phenomenon rather than a psychological construct drives insight and intuition. So the role of interoception in intuition is also underpinned by embodied cognition and the free energy principle. It is well known that interoceptive signals such as heart rate, respiratory rate, and visual sensations like gut movements impact cognitive processes. By providing valuable information about internal states, these signals also contribute to the brain's predictive imperative, helping to optimize the body-brain environment system by reducing uncertainty, which is why I've used internal models as a concept before. So we have the optimization cycle that happens externally between the agent and the arena, or the agent and the environment, but then you have all these processes that happen internally in terms of optimizing and updating and upgrading the agent in terms with all of the other things that are happening and exist biologically. Like this even goes into like nested consciousness, right? Saying that a cell has an intelligence or a mind. This is the work done by Michael Levin, which is, again, this is not the purview of what we're doing here, but just to kind of bring that in as well, this is how my brain works, clearly, in a very integrated fashion. So whenever I pull a thread, then 1,000 things pop up. But this is why, again, like I hammer on like the entire layered approach and as quote unquote holistic as possible, or rather as integrative as possible, because I want to be able to, when I'm coaching people, when I'm teaching people, show them like, okay, like it's great if you do this one thing or that one thing, but look at how much other elements there are to it. And that's not to, like drive them crazy or overwhelm them, just to help them understand like, hey, there are levels to this that you address simultaneously when we're doing things, which is making sure that, as I call it, the bottom up, right, that you just give it a general term, that your bottom up, all your biology, physiology, and neurology are doing what they're supposed to do and work optimally, right, that we upgrade or optimize the internal environment so that you as an agent can be the best or most agentic agent possible, right? To make your decision making as good as possible, which we'll get into later. So there's so much more in terms of these like visceral sensations. There's like the basal gastric rhythm. That's also an interoceptive feature. There's mitoception, which is the perception or interoception rather of the state of and function of the mitochondria. I mean, when you think about it, that's crazy, right? So when we're talking like here in the slide, rather, when it's presented as it's the gut-brain axis, it really should say that it's like the everything to the brain axis, right? Like all of these different organs and systems that are interoceptively communicating, or at least sending information is communication, sending information to the brain on the internal state. And this is a key part, right, to this body-brain environment, because your brain is embedded, right? It's not a Cartesian black box inside your skull. It's an entire embodied thing. It's interconnected at all of these different levels with these different sensations. And we know, like, when you are in different states, then, physiologically, then your intuition has degrees of not just intensity but of accuracy, and that's, I think, the key aspect here to keep in mind. So that is, to say or to expand, which is, when we talk about these cognitive mechanisms, or they talk about cognitive processes, right, and the impact thereof. I think another part, and this is featured in the book, I talk about it very often, but I still want to emphasize it now, is that the gut is its own brain, right? It has neurons, it has an entire sensory system, and the heart is a brain as well. It also has neurons. It also does a lot of communication as a standalone organ that has its predictive capabilities and intelligent capabilities, or intelligible capabilities. And again, with the gut, the same thing, which is also why the brain is embodied, right? Like if they take your heart away, like clearly that would form an issue. If it took your entire gut out, that would also form an issue, because this entire ability for cognitive processes to work and all these other models and predictions, etc., the other brains and every other organ has to like work in harmoniously and independently at a good enough level so that there are clear signals instead of error signals, right? Inflammation in the gut, in the heart, inflammation in the heart is really bad, but inflammation in other organs, systemic inflammation that is on the nerves, or even just inflammation on the vagus nerve, these would all cause noise in the system and degrade your ability for your interoception, and then down the line your intuition, right? It also messes with your emotion, which is why I write about it in the book, because your emotions are also generated from the synthesis of all these interoceptive signals, right? They're bidirectional, which means that the more of this, metabolic insults or biological insults like inflammation and stress that are happening on these organ systems and these nerves, and even into your cells, the cells themselves, their mitochondria, the more noise you will experience throughout the entire global system, the harder interoception or intuition becomes, and the more muted things becomes, or the more amplified certain emotions become when you are in certain quote unquote, like, or between parentheses, disordered states, right? And unordered states. And I think that's really the key premise of why interoception from the gut to the brain, from the heart to the brain, from every other organ to the brain, and all the interplay between all your organs, that drives the signaling and the unconscious or subconscious processing of all of this information. And when we just go through that like this, then you can see that it's a lot of information that it's dealing with, right? People still very often take the brain as the sole proprietor, or like system that has cognitive functions or intelligent functions, when it's really its interconnection to the rest of the system that makes it what it is. And I think that's a good way to close off this section, and so we can move into the next one. In the next segment, we will explore a little bit more how, very often the client asks, like, okay, then how do I know, right, about my intuition, or that it's good, or there's a kind of like a recognition element here that is very that's just some uncertainty about it, right? The uncertainty is just like around the free energy principle. That's why I'm laughing, because it just comes back so often, and there's a lot of wasted energy in certain senses that goes around with this, because it's just not clear to them. But they kind of give a concept that I've also heard from John Vervaeke, which refers to an optimal grip. So this is a term coined by the philosopher Merleau-Ponty, and normally an optimal grip refers to an organism's attempt to understand and then maximize the potential benefits of all the available affordances in an environment, with affordances referring to J.J. Gibson's description of objects as opportunities for action. And this is kind of what the optimal grip is about. Like, that is typical when you have a signature with enough of these, everything that came before, when we put that in there, right? All of these like subconscious, unconscious, like interoceptive, emotional inputs that comes together into an intuition, and sometimes an insight, they come together. then you can use that like to optimal grip something with like it's kind of like, to use that analogy, the way a child starts gripping, like in the beginning, like they don't know what an optimal grip is, right? It's either too strong, it's too loose, they drop things. And this is kind of the same that I would argue when you just don't have enough reference points, or you don't have enough affordances that lead to good actions, and then you maybe lack some data. So now, as we continue, they're going to go on more into depth a little bit around this optimal grip and the unsolved problem. So, in short, when an unsolved problem's attractor landscape precludes the resolution of uncertainty, the brain moves towards the edge of criticality in order to obtain an optimal grip and reduce free energy. We note, however, that cognitive optimal grip does not rely on an exhaustive analysis of all environmental variables. Instead, it emerges through interaction with structure regularities, intrinsically motivated, or in other words, epistemic affordances, heuristics or priors, and salient cues within high-dimensional and dynamically shifting environments. In this view, intuitive behavior reflects an embodied engagement with both the environmental and internal constraints, enabling adaptive responses in computationally challenging real-world contexts, which, I mean, I think elegantly puts together some of the stuff that we've just been talking about, right? That you very often around, intuition, especially if you're very quote unquote left brain, if you're very logical, maybe even rational, then that seems very like, how do I know? How do I know? Well, this is how we know, right? Like in an environment which is as dynamic as the real world tends to be, right, or reality, you can't have an exhaustive analysis or all the information. I think we all know it just doesn't work that way. And a lot of work from John Vervaeke, he talks about this as well, because it's a problem even when they were building AIs, that the possibility space, they call it like combinatorial explosion, that it's just, there's so many options, right? You just, it's too much to figure out by analysis alone, which is why they say that you have heuristics, priors, salient cues, right, within these dynamic shifting environments, and that you engage through that with these adaptive responses, right, and internal, well, constraints, but I would just say like all of these other internal cues, and like priors are a part of that, right? These are like belief states and things that have happened to you that would form a prior, and your attractor landscapes also form a prior, and that goes into this entire ability to shift through all this information intuitively, right? Because you're using another part of you rather than just pure analysis, that allows you to make not just necessarily good decisions, although that would also be ideal, but allows you to create an optimal grip, or at least a better grip on the circumstances that in such a dynamic environment, right? Like that's why we're using all of these like interoceptive emotional aspects that feed into intuition. So they go on to state that there's again more levels on the what is it, the neuroanatomy, and in this case they talk more extensively about the hippocampus. So I just want to like read a part of this as it's another key feature here. So importantly, the hippocampus, which stores memory, right, and does memory processing, and the entorhinal cortex not only store locations, events, and facts from the past, that's what they define memory as, they also use these locations, events, and facts to chart possible paths forward, ergo action planning. So then we're back to the navigational aspect of how all of this information, right, is used across the layers of the conscious and the subconscious. So we're going to go in a bit deeper from one of the authors that I mispronounced his name, I'm pretty sure last time, Buzaki and Linnaeus state navigation and memory are deeply connected. Analogous to map and path-based navigation, there are two forms of hippocampal system-dependent memories: memorized facts or semantic memory, and one's personal experiences, episodic memory. To re-experience egocentric episodes, we project ourselves back in space and time, which is episodic recall, whereas traveling in the imagined future represents planning, prediction. This aligns with findings on the pre-selection effect in short-term motor memory, where planned movements are more accurately reproduced than passive or constrained runs, likely due to corollary discharge signals that predict the sensory consequences of intended actions. Both of these ideas are further bolstered by the work of Walter Freeman, who noted that intentional action, or what could be considered the source of causal agency, begins with future goals and the actions required to reach those goals as an intentional arc. So that again puts together a lot of these elements that we've been exploring, but also the actual pathfinding that takes place, and that very often when I'm coaching people or talking to people, then this idea of the future, right, as they talk about, projecting yourself into the future, and that the future goals and actions required to reach these goals are a part of the pathfinding process. There's actually a Seneca quote that comes to mind. I believe it goes something of the sort: if you don't know which port you're sailing to, then no wind is favorable. And that's why, like, when you have all this information, if it doesn't have a direction, it is going to produce certain things. And it's difficult to say it's going to be random. It's not going to be completely random, since there are so many priors involved in all of this, as we just saw in attractor landscapes, right? So a part of that is going to be determined by this. But you can orient a lot of these processes and systems and mechanisms towards something that you need or want to achieve, or dream to achieve, or want to build towards, or envision, or whatever it is, right, in this case. And I think that presents itself as very elegant, not just metaphor, but analogy. I think that it does have that the actual pathfinding mechanism as navigation of your behavior, because it's, again, like, it's an orientation towards, like, where am I taking this? Some people are stronger with this or in that, and there's many different reasons why that's the case, right? From everything that we're exploring here, like all of these biological, neurobiological facets are clearly involved in this. So this is to continue. They have another section on this that I think contributes really well to the point that we're making here. Freeman's work also shows that action demands prediction and characterizes emotion as a kind of prediction, or what he called the stretching forth of intentionality and the anticipation of future action. So in this framework, intuition is a predictive emotion representing the expected outcome of a particular path of action, which is also very interesting. And then they kind of like go full circle here. Equally critical, Freeman also argued that the signal originates in the hippocampus. As he states, the global interaction of the motor, sensory, and associational areas create a spatial temporal pattern that is conceived to express the present brain state, which is just another way of saying that when you put the neurobiology of it together, right? Like, since so much happens in the hippocampus that not just deals apparently with memory, right, but the action planning, the charting the possible paths, then all of these other elements that make action possible, since they're related and interconnected, that's what he's talking about here with the global interaction of motor, sensory, and associational areas that create a spatio-temporal pattern, which a spatio-temporal just kind of means that's a space that also affords a path, right? Or affords rather navigation, and then we can find a path. I hope that kind of makes sense. That the brain works very typically with exaptation. It will use certain brain areas or functions, systems, mechanisms in order to facilitate or afford other things, right? Like in psychological navigation in terms of a telos, a goal, right? Your teleological capacities are also driven and function through these different areas of and functions of the brain. And clearly, that the hippocampus is strongly involved in this. So then we kind of come to the big differences that can occur between people in terms of intuition. And this, like, in my opinion, has a general and a specific element to it, right? There's just people that are just generally like, they have strong intuitions, like in just whatever realm. Like their baseline intuition is good. Then there is your niching, right? Your specificity, where for me personally, a lot of this is, neuropsychologically. It has a lot to do with people and the patterns that, psychology, philosophy, and biology take. And I don't mean it to complete like mechanistic things that relate to the what is it, metabolism or something of the sort. Although I can have intuitions about that too. It's more like behavior, actions, the way brains work, and the way they interact with the world and themselves, right? So a lot of these like modeling things, it's that's what I'm saying. So somebody that's really mathematical will have intuitions about math. Someone that's really musical will have intuitions about music. You see the point that I'm trying to make, right? Like that is just an aspect of generalization, I guess, maybe that's a word, and specificity. And that some people, they are very dominant in the specific intuitions and don't have good general intuitions. And there's a that's why we're kind of doing this part of the exploration, like what you are exposed to, as we saw, your priors, your attractor landscapes, and all these other facets obviously are going to dictate and influence and impact how your intuition works, right? And this pathfinding works. And I think that's a key concept. So they also relate this, that in this framework, intuition requires a comparison between a current situational pattern and a situational pattern stored in memory from previous experiences, or what is termed the recognition primed decision model, which makes a lot of sense, right? Like it's pretty difficult to optimize certain aspects of all of this when you haven't had the exposure to things. And this is how brains change, right? Like in the whole nurture versus nature debates, like if you put people in a different environment, then they're also going to have certain adaptations, habituation, and changes, and in their psychology and their neurology and their entire biology. So in this case, or in this way, this is quite important. So they talk about this more, about like these higher level loops, right? Kind of what this panel is supposed to illustrate, that you have a recruiter or a lower ability for intuition, and a more equal, like between parentheses, expertise like fashion in intuition. So as they put here in the paper, thus the difference between intuition and inference in the language of the free energy principle is not categorical, but a matter of degree and temporal resolution. Intuition reflects fast heuristic inference operating at lower levels of the hierarchy, typically without the top-down cognitive axis or reflective goal modulation. In contrast, deliberate inference engages slower, higher-level loops that allow for the flexible revision of priors and explicit planning. Still, both are enacted through the same underlying imperative to reduce expected free energy and optimize agent-environment coupling. So this also comes back to a part of the optimal gripping. There's even an optimal grip between these two, right? That where you have these fast-acting, intuitive at the lower levels, and then you have a deliberate, inference the higher level loops, right, that allow you to revise priors, which just means that you can update previous belief states about either the internal models or external models. And this is also like, it divides these two brains in that way, that somebody that's very practiced at this, which is also a part of what I do personally, but a big part of what I do professionally, is having people build these higher level loops for this flexible revision of their priors and explicit planning, because we need to challenge and go through revising a lot of their belief states, which also allows them down the line to make better intuitive decisions, which comes back to this entire interoception emotion funnel, let's call it, right, or integration. And the more time we spend together, the more they do the practices, the more they do the top down. It's kind of like homework. It's just like different psychological drills or tasks, in whether that's journaling, whether that's imaginal, and we get to some of these towards the end of the video as well, to explain how some of these things work. But that allows them to garner all of these data points, right? And then again, like working on their neurobiology just in general, and their biology, to make sure that all their organs are kind of doing what they're supposed to do. And then your ability to create a flexible and fine-tuned intuition pathfinding engine is far better, at least in my experience, professionally and personally. And I like, for me as well, like that's as they call it, like these are a part of it is transient. And for me, it's very state dependent, meaning that if I'm not in a good state, if I have a lot of this inflammation, stress, like certain like issues like mold, or dealing with a heavy metal problem, although I don't think that's currently a big thing for me, but just other things of like maybe toxin buildup from the environment, whatever, yada yada yada, doesn't really technically matter, then my ability to lean into my intuition is severely diminished. But also like my ability to optimize the agent environment coupling, right, the agent arena coupling, that starts becoming more difficult. Like, I'm fortunate in many ways that I've done this for so long, at the many different levels, that allows me to kind of like ride my momentum, which effectively just means that the deeper part of my brain, the deeper layer, has had so much conditioning and wiring that it just does that automatically. I think a good representation of that is like when people ask like, oh, are you, like, do you ever like lose motivation? Like, yeah, man, sometimes I'm just not motivated to go train. But how I feel, that doesn't matter that much in this regard. Like when you put that in the way of in the expression of the attractor state, like I have a very robust attractor state when it comes to, working out. Like I just built that over a very long time. That allows me that like whatever state I'm in, I just bounce back to the training thing where I'm like, okay, I just go train. That's just one aspect of optimizing the agent arena, coupling the feedback loop. But there's many other ones, right, internally as well, like in terms of how you use your narratives, because those can conflict with intuitions, they can conflict with emotions or align with emotions, right? Again, there's so much around this, and it's already a long video, and I'm just rattling on at this point. But that helps you understand that the more you practice these things, right, the more you see that all of these facets internally change, from priors to heuristics to attractor landscapes to interoception and other emotional or emotion cues or feedback loops, systems, mechanisms, you name it. This brings us to a concluding point, right? Rather than the practices that are still coming, or some of them that I will elaborate on, I think this is where you can kind of see like the dispositional overview of what I said before about like you have people that are quite intuitive, and they typically already have a very integrated sense of these systems and etc. mechanisms into their right brain, right? So again, like the nuance and complexity of the hemispheric thing, let's just leave that aside for a moment. Maybe we'll revisit that because it's, again, a lot to sift through. But people that are more connected to their emotions and these structures in the right brain, and thus the right hemisphere, they typically, like, these are the people that are also like they lead their life, or they do a lot of this pathfinding based on intuition and emotion when that's aligned, right? And I don't mean this in a hedonic treadmill sense. I mean that in understanding what is right for them, as I think I highlighted before, that these are all indications of what works for you and is aligned for you. And like there's a lot of neurometabolic signaling that goes into this as well, as we kind of saw with the variational free energy, the cost prediction that the brain does in this way. Anyway, so for other types of people, right, that are more logical, that are more left-brained, that are more detail-oriented, they want to do this heavy analysis. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. Like that's where I'm kind of like leading this to. You need both, technically, right? And that's essentially, this is also what they are. This isn't the definition of hemispheric integration at a technical level. It's just an aspect of hemispheric integration, that I can use both systems, right? And or in, like Daniel Kahneman's terminology as his framework with like system 1 and system 2, it also reflects, like the nervous system side of it, that system 1, I think it was the fast acting system, yeah, and system 2 is the slow acting system. You kind of see this represented here as well, right? Intuition, snap, quick, here we go. Analysis, it's slower. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just about how to get an optimal grip, right? Literally. And that's why I like that terminology between these hemispheric elements, or between these, functions or mechanisms, or if you want to use Kahneman's terminology, between these two systems. Because I believe, like this is a prior, clearly, that has been created through my work and my own experiences, that when you optimize, for me personally, right, again, like the thing that I've worked with so much is optimizing these internal models. And then like there's obviously an element of my work that deals with the agent arena aspect, but I deal in the beginning a lot more with the internal aspects of these models. Because when you can tap into your emotions and they are integrated, and your interoception is working quite well, and we train your interoception, then it seems to me like your intuition just gets better generally, right? And then you have an optimal grip, typically, that emerges from that. So I think, some clients can have, it's almost a fear, right, of being too impressionable, or too adaptable, or too flexible in these regards when it comes to intuition, or that it's ungrounded, which is a very logical way to think about things. Again, it's not bad. It has a self-preservation element to it as well, which is typical in people with certain backgrounds. This can be related to trauma as well, because then the self-preservation hinges on certain a decision-making process that is more analytical and less emotional. Like there's, again, like a dispositional element into this, because it's not originating from trauma, as that is the causal effect of this necessarily. Just to make the point that there's so much, individual neuropsychology and bioindividuality at play here. But the point remains the same, that when you have someone that's very, in between parentheses, left-brained, then you teach them to be more right-brained. If you have someone that's very right-brained, without a lot of these like top-down inhibitory mechanisms, or like lack of planning, right, then you just bring them back to a more of an analytical approach, or mechanism that relies on taking a step back and analyzing, like, is that aligned with my goals or not? I do think, or I do believe that that also becomes more intuitive as you get more clarity on, like your values and your virtues, or virtue in a Platonic sense, which is courage, justice, wisdom, and temperance, which kind of translates to self-discipline. But that's just the framework that I typically use. Anyway, the point remains the same, that I think a lot of these things can be streamlined, which is, how these heuristics also occur in biases, right? To a certain extent, like those are things that have happened to you sometimes they're just innate, instinctual. Then that allows you to make intuitive judgments. And like, I've read multiple books on this as well, and there's a lot of that goes into it, which is, using different or more instinctual patterns, let's say, right? And that can be attributed to different things. Matters less in this case. Just to clarify or reiterate the point, that I think you're looking for an optimal grip between these two systems, and that if you haven't built a good connection to your intuitive systems, then that is something that I would wholeheartedly recommend spending some time on. So that's also what the next segment will be about. The final segment will be about some of these practices or ideas on how to do this. I mean, I think, implicitly that this has kind of been stated, but I like to explicitly state them or explore them a bit more in the last and final section of this video. So this last segment will focus on the practices. Each book I close with a practice section. This book is a big book, so it also has a lot of different practices that I'm going to try to make both quite extensive, but also like try to get a structure in there, which I've done in terms of, interoceptive practices, emotion practices, intuition practices, and then the practices that are, seen as more esoteric. I'm not 100% sure on the last one yet, because I still need to figure that part out. So let's just kind of run through the most obvious ones here, because meditation, there's some data to suggest, because I was reading these papers, but I've read so much, I can't recall everything. It's, especially in my state, is not the best state at the moment, so my recall is also impaired. In this case, I remember the gist, and the gist was that yes, when you meditate, your intuition becomes better. That also has something to do with the impact it has on the hippocampus, right? As we saw that it deals with action planning, not just memory, but also charting a path through all of that information, and projecting, forwards into the future. Your hippocampus is a part of that as well. And it had other elements that have to do with I think memory retrieval, and then just in general, your ability to tap into your interoceptive feedback. So there's different forms to meditate, and that's an element of it, right? You have interoceptive feedback practices that could be called meditative practices as well, because you just shut out all of this information. There's one that I really, really gravitates towards, that I got from John Vervaeke. I'm not quite sure what he called it. I think it's the 3-center meditation, or maybe that's just a term that I put on top of it because I was maybe I just didn't pay attention well enough. Regardless, effectively, this meditation is quite simple, but it's really good at the interoceptive connection, which is you close your eyes, and in his, now I'm jumping, but in his process, this precedes other things. So there's other things that precede rather this practice in and of itself, but I just find it beneficial to just do like this without any other preceding elements, except for you stand or you sit down, you close your eyes, and then you try to hone in on the three centers. And for me, and this is, because my interoceptive capabilities are already quite fine-tuned or well developed, I'm looking for a pulse. Not just the pulse of my heart, but like you can kind of find that in the gut. So that's the first center, right? The first brain even. Then I'm looking for that pulse in the heart area, which for some people, like this is also has to do with the connection of that nerve that goes into the right side of the brain, surprise, surprise, where this interoceptive feedback is transmitted. And that also different people respond to it in different ways. But anyway, like that's an aside. That's the second center. And then I try to find the pulse in my brain, in my head, effectively. So once that has been established, so usually I tell a client or somebody that I'm coaching through this, like you just kind of stay with that feeling, that sensation. It can be warmth, right? For me, it's pulsing. It's just, that's what I relate to. So that's why I vocalize it as such. Then you stay with it until that fills your awareness. The same with the center of the heart, which for a lot of generally is easier. Like I can't see a lot of people, like again, because of how certain nerves are connected to the brain or people's ability to tap into it. So for some people, that's actually the harder center, which will really just depend on a lot of the things that we just explored. And then I tell them the same thing. All right, stick with that until it becomes more like dominant and it fills your awareness. Then you go to the head center. Once you have a lock, as I would call it, right, that you have a beat on them, then you try to synchronize these centers. And for me, again, like the synchronization is a pulsing sensation that all of them pulse at the same rhythm, which also, like, that's why I've been saying about this interoceptive feedback, that's also going to be a big part of the book, but that's a great way to become more sensitive to your interoception, at least in my opinion. There are so many different ways to do it, and this video isn't about the 1,000 ways to create interoceptive, the sensitivity. It's just a way to do it. So they talk in this slide, the meditation we've kind of covered, mindfulness, present moment awareness. I think that's a great one because it allows you to very often shift from like a more of this like analytical to a process of analysis, or maybe it's not analysis. Like when I contemplate, it's just like I'm running through things at a natural, like automatic way for me. It's like when I'm just, I can also completely zone out, and then there's no analysis or no default network activation. It's just pure presence. So you can have both, and both of them follow their own benefits or their own, like mechanism functionality in this way. So there's nothing wrong with either of them. It's just kind of what you need or prefer in certain senses. But the reason why I brought up this, when it's a processing, right, this quote unquote analyzation, it's more like a contemplative mode that you go into. It's very close to like daydreaming for me, if you want to put a term on it. So it's not the hard analytical thinking, which also leads me to assume or intuit that it has a different like brainwave, signature. So then for me, you're going into like this liminal space between your subconscious and your conscious, where some of this information is like, I would say rapidly, it's just kind of like that's a subjective experience, of course, that just comes into conscious awareness and just you kind of brew through it. And sometimes that leads to an insight, or that leads to some processing that allows me to go like, oh, okay, it cultivates an insight in certain senses. So that can help with your intuition as well. Sometimes, as they said in the paper, taking a break, right, distancing yourself, which is the complete present immersion of awareness, can also do that. So that even when you're completely present, these other layers of your brain are still doing stuff that allow you to maybe come with an intuition or an insight later down the line. The last thing, they kind of come together, right? The experience building is obviously it is exposing yourself to so many different environments and situations. I mean, for me at least, they kind of come together, because the more you broaden your knowledge, like that's in this maybe example, or the way that this infographic was built, that's very analytical as well. That's like, okay, I'm working my way through a book, a piece of information, like my understanding of things, which we need to upgrade these models anyway, right? Like the agent arena models are also based on what John Vervaeke calls propositional knowledge. So you have propositional, procedural, perspectival, and participatory. The last two being more action orientated, which is probably what the other part is supposed to symbolize, this pattern exposure, which, for me, that's one of the biggest ones, is that you want to gain as much exposure to as many situations, circumstances, environments as possible. And like, even for me, like, that is to say that it's also with the arena, with the environment, but also internally, like I want to have as much internal reference points as possible, so that I can make very fine-tuned models of my internal experience that I can use when I'm coaching. That also, like, I'm high in openness as a trait, so that kind of comes pretty natural to me when it comes to compounds, or psychedelics or drugs. I mean, I'm not saying I'm using drugs in the normal sense. I don't drink alcohol or take hard drugs or anything, or even smoke weed. It's just that, like, I like these, like, different pharmacological interventions rather, like bromantane, the racetams, different types of supplements, because they give me different sensory states, or like just different experiential states. And that's one element of exposure. The other element of exposure, as I said, is more externally oriented, which is people, places, etc. And that allows you down the line, as this suggests, this infographic, right, to make good intuitions around these complexities, and recognizing the patterns in very dynamic situations, which is eventually, right, like it also talked about that, about these like dynamic and what was the thing that it said, this dynamic landscapes, or dynamic just environments, right? That the reality or the external world is as dynamic as it is, and that we need to be adaptable in this way. Oh yeah, here it was. In enabling adaptive responses in computationally challenging real-world contexts, which is, to me, right, a very good case for this pattern exposure, where the more reference points you get from you have been exposed to so much, the better your intuition gets. And that's why I related before that the specificity of my intuitions have a lot to do with people, because I've been coaching for 15 years, and all the neuroscience and philosophy that I read on top of that, which is the experience building, broadening knowledge aspect, allow me to make pretty good intuitions and upgrade and fine-tune these models. And I've just been in so many different environments to train people or to meet people. I've coached across so many different backgrounds, right? And that's just to give you the idea of like where a lot of this stuff comes from, is because like I'm spending a lot of time in those four categories, so to say, right? That I spent a lot of time building exposure, and I've spent a lot of time experiencing like trying to build my knowledge, and then I've gone into all of these different mindfulness, meditation, interoceptive practices. So this is a very rudimentary framework about building intuition or cultivating intuition. This is going to be expanded on massively in the book, which is, that will be available on Substack at some point, and the physical release will follow afterwards. I think maybe, I wouldn't say I'm halfway through writing the book, but at least it's all extensive part of it has been written. So this is really like the end of the video, and the kind of, I think, how future approaches will be expressed in terms of like how I'm going to tackle some papers. I've got a few more ideas for videos. I think another another video is going to be on like maybe a bit more free flow, less reading of these segments, but anyway, like I'll also do reading of other papers that I found interesting, because I have stacks upon stacks, as you can kind of hear, and maybe I'll take a picture of it at some point to show you like the amount of papers that I get to have printed out, because I hate reading digitally. Anyway, so as we near the end of the video, I think it's just, customary, like and subscribe if you like what you heard. If it makes sense, like please comment if there's anything that could use an elaboration, or that you want to see, or any you can add practices in the comment section as well. Like I said, like this isn't meant to be exhaustive or absolute in this way, but I think that as a starting point for people that want to connect to their intuition, like this is a good place to start, especially when you use some of the that interoceptive practice that I explained. So here we are at the end of the video. If you have any additional questions that you would like to ask, then you can always ask them in the comment section, and that would be appreciated. Or you can engage with my material on Substack as well. A lot of my work there is free. My previous books are also free on Substack, by the way, which is The Attachment Compass, The Path to Your Aspirational Self. Then I have the Platonic Spirituality, which is really a misnomer, which the book is about the prayer in laws that Plato puts forth on how to pray. I found that very beneficial, so I wrote that as a framework. Then I made a little book out of it for my clients. And of course, the next book will be The Intuitive Self, and how to rely on the wisdom, let's say, of your intuition, interoception, and emotion. So that's it. This was the entire video. I hope you guys enjoyed yourself and that you found it insightful.